sanction or accountability encourage him to invade Ukraine in February 2022. Finally, so accountability and leadership responsibility. So under the international law, status, the state are responsible for violation committed by members of their armed forces or person or identities authorized by states, and must open investigation and commit to pay full comprehensive to make redresses for the survival, the victims' families. I'm jumping quickly. Zero investigation been opened in Syria by Syrian regime or Russia forces. Total neglected in committing any of those crimes. We cannot, because of the nature of Syrian regime and the Russian forces, they are central regime. None of those attacks can be implemented without an order coming from the top leader. It's very centralized regime, and so that means Bashar al-Assad, Putin are deeply involved in those crimes. So over the years, the Syrian regime and the Russian forces not launched a single investigator, even held any single individual, no matter how lowly his rank, accountable for any of those violations. Indeed, instead of investigation and punishing perpetrator of these heinous crimes, the Syrian regime promoted and rewarded dozens of those involved in these violations because they had demonstrated strongly loyalty to the Syrian regime. This impunity and this immunity for the perpetrator of violation by the leaders of the Syrian regime and Russia, and the local and the jurisdiction in Syria is paralyzed, in addition to the abject failure to the Security Council and the international community to protect civilians and stop crimes against humanity in Syria. ICC can prosecute the perpetrator, but the Syria and Russia does not ratify the court charter. Therefore, the Security Council must refer the situation in Syria to the ICC, and that's not happened, and that will not gonna to happen, especially after Russia interfered military in Syria in 2015. So now what we have in our mind, 2 minutes.
Briefly, please.
Yeah, I'm jumping very quickly. So we have 2 things in our mind: sanction tools, which is effective deterrent, but it will not work alone. The second one is the universal jurisdiction, and there is, which is also an essential step toward accountability, but it's not enough. We reviewed all the verdicts based on universal jurisdiction, and there is only 36 court rulings. The vast majorities of those are cases related to terrorism. So I think that sanction and universal jurisdiction are limited impact on accountability process, and I believe that we should not limit accountability to the judicial track only, as the concept of accountability is much broader, and I believe the biggest form of accountability that Syrian regime can't be exposed is a serious advancement to the political process that will lead to a transitional movement Without this transitional movement, it will be no peace or stability in Syria.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this very rich presentation with lots of charts and information and data. I know your center has worked very hard, Fadel Abdul Ghany, and those who are interested in getting the most updated information, they can get in touch with you through the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. Your presentation has made it very clear that zero accountability is actually the main cause for about 300,000 civilian deaths that has gone unpunished. So let's turn to Kiev with our very special guest, Ms. Oleksandra Matviichuk. She will be highlighting the other picture, which is also grim, with a little bit of hope for accountability through the major arrangements made recently. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Dear colleagues, thank you very much for providing me a floor. I would like to start and express my solidarity with the Syrian people. When I heard this enormous amount of crimes, which was described by the previous speaker, I know that it's not a numbers, it's a human lives. And I want to say that as a human being, I understand your pain, and I'm inspired by your constant effort to restore justice for the victims of the international crimes which is committed in Syria. My name is Oleksandra Matviichuk. I'm Ukrainian human rights defender. I have been documenting war crimes since this war started, because Russia invaded Ukraine not in February this year. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 with occupation of Crimea and part of Donbas. And since that time, we have been documenting war crimes, and I personally focus on the practice of illegal abduction, torture, murder, sexual violence, and other kinds of offenses against civilians. But when the large-scale invasion started in February this year, we understood that we probably will face with a much more numbers of crimes. That's why we restore our initiative, brought up several hundreds of volunteers, and now we jointly documenting war crimes across the country and gather testimonies of the victims of these crimes. Together with other Ukrainian human rights organizations, we joined in one initiative which is called Tribunal for Putin initiative. And in our database for current moment, we have more than 8,900 cases. So my previous colleague told about the main principle of international humanitarian law, which obliged each party of the law to fulfill the norm and to even during the law. But I would like to present three main trends which we observe in Ukraine, and to understand that this is prohibited. There is no necessity to know international humanitarian law, because it's very obvious even for ordinary people without such kind of knowledge. So the first trend which we observe, that Russia is simply using war crimes as a method of warfare. And such actions are not justified by any military necessity. Russia simultaneously, systematically provided deliberate attacks on different civilian objects like hospitals, kindergarten, schools, residential buildings, and critical civilian infrastructure, using of human shields, attacks on specially protected objects like nuclear power plants, We also documented rape and other gender-based violence, deliberate killings, torture and ill treatment, enforced disappearances, and other civilian offenses against civilians. Second, Russia deliberately isolated and blockaded cities, which is a result in enormous suffering of civilians. The bright example is Mariupol, but this story is repeated with dozens of other cities in Ukraine. Russian troops terrorize population of the city with hunger, don't let humanitarian assistance to reach the cities, and shelling on people who try to evacuate. Russia destroyed a critical civilian infrastructure and forced people to live in basement for weeks without water, food, electricity, medical cares. Russia don't provide permission for International Committee of Red Cross to open humanitarian corridors. Instead of it, Russia illegally moves hundreds of thousands of civilians to its territory. And now is the question how these people without money and documents can legally cross the border. And third, Russia started political persecutions in the new occupied territories after 24 February this year. And every day we received a lot of information from people who remains with the occupiers on the territories about physical violence, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, and other forms of persecutions. It's a military tactics to identify and to liquidate the ability to provide even peaceful resistance. That's why in our database, there are a lot of people who are local representatives of local authorities, journalists, human rights defenders, civil activists, volunteers, religious leaders, famous art leaders, etc. But also in some territories, Russia organized not only political persecution, but a terror. And it's very visible when you go into details what happened only for several weeks in cities and settlements in Kiev region, when Russia tried to circle Kiev and occupy the capital of our country.
I hope we can get her back. This is what happened with the...
Connection was lost. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I will repeat the last sentence, that in this Kiev region, for example, Russia organized a terror. And when you saw this picture from Bucha, where people were lay on the ground and they were shooting to death without any distinctions who they are, like combatants or civilians, where any distinctions, what kind of civilians they are, like journalists or local authorities or like ordinary farmers. You understand that you face with a terror against civilians. And several conclusions in this regard of these tendencies, which I tried to describe in my speech. The first conclusion is that Russia uses war crimes as a method of warfare because Russia tried to occupy the country and break the people resistance by mean what I call the immense pain of civilian population. That's why we have such huge level of cruelty and some enormous amount of people who are suffering. Second, we appeared in a situation when we as a human rights lawyers couldn't rely upon on any legal instrument. All my knowledge of international humanitarian law, all of my experience to work with UN system, Council of Europe system, OSCE system, couldn't provide me opportunity to release even one single person from captivity. The law is not work at all when we speak about Russia. And third, for decades, Russian troops enjoyed impunity and committed war crimes in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Syria, in Mali, in Libya, and other countries of the world. And this large-scale invasion was a result of total impunity for Russia for the past decades and total inactivity of international community to hold these criminals accountable. So now I think we have a historical task to break this circle of impunity and to stop Russian troops to committed crimes, not only in Ukraine, but in other countries of the world. And that's why Ukrainian human rights defender promotes the idea of creation international hybrid tribunal. Unfortunately, even in case of Ukraine, we couldn't rely upon only to International Criminal Court, who started their investigation because they will selected only several cases. And the question on the table, how to provide effective justice to all victims of dozens of thousands international crimes, which is committed even for current moment. So I think that we have to unite our efforts and to stop this impunity and to save lives of another people and to restore justice for victims who have already suffered. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your brief presentation, but quite powerful. The picture, as I said, is very grim, although in the case of Ukraine, there has been an international effort to move forward and to make it clear that the regime of Putin would not go unpunished. But as you said, the law is still not working because international hasn't been enforced, unfortunately, whether in Syria, Ukraine, or Palestine, or other regions. I think the issue that has been raised all over is the issue of accountability. And zero accountability leads to all the crimes that we have listened to. So before we move to the question answer section, I believe that the ambassador of Ukraine and probably the ambassador of Syria may have a few words, and please take the floor. And okay, and if you could just focus on what has not been said, so we can keep it short, please. Thank you.
Oh, okay, yes. Distinguished audience, I would like to praise the Center for Conflict and Human Studies for choosing such a topical theme for the discussions, since the issue is of the great importance for the future of the humanity. The question is whether we will slide down to the abyss of violations of the perpetration of crimes, violations of human rights, in fact, into the mid-ages, or will at this point turn to the future. I would also praise the speakers for kind of very detailed and comprehensive information. It is a difficult task for me to add something, but as a former military, I would like to point out also few issues which are inseparably connected with the topic of the today's session. First of all, I would kindly request to think whether it is the indiscriminate use of the weapons or it is deliberate use. I would shift the emphasis of the discussion for the deliberate use of the military power. Why? In both cases, in both countries, and in a lot of countries through all over the world, the main perpetrators are the Russian troops. I think that if we will more carefully analyze the figures of these victims and we'll try to attribute them to the Syrian regime or to the, no, Syrian, better to say to the Assad regime, sorry, this is a cliche, to the Assad regime or the Russians, I think we have to change the figures and much more of that victims should be attributed to the Russians, since they simply use the labeled with the Syrian regime, Assad's regime aircrafts by the use of their own pilots. It's also was not once taken. But the terror was chosen by the Russians as the means of warfare due to the certain reasons. First of all, the low quality of their army. They can do nothing but kill. They can do nothing but either fight against the people without arms in their hand, as it is in Syria, or trying to, if I may, to kill the enemy by the dead bodies of their own soldiers. This is the tactic of 19th century, 18th century, but not the 21st century. Low quality of their weapons. Indeed, they are using the sophisticated weapons like the cruise missiles, but they already have the shortage in the stocks. Some of them, a lot of them, in fact, at the Ukrainian territory were intercepted and eliminated. And now they are taken from the old stock of the 60s, of the 70s, the old Soviet rocket systems to be used with the coefficient of the deviation up to kilometers, up to 100 and 100 meters, which is making this arm no less harmful, but much more harmful for the indiscriminately chosen targets. Another issue of their military and political tactic. This is a unification between the policy, propaganda, military actions, and terror at the temporary occupied territories. They are acting such due to the understanding of weakness of the international institutions, and this weakness, in a great extent, could be explained by the role, absolutely groundless role, of Russia in the United Nations. In fact, Russia, as a Russian Federation, has never been elected as the member state, and has never been. If we will open the UN chart, we will see Soviet Union. And just to see this monstrous-like tactic, we can analyze similarity of Aleppo, of Mariupol, of Ukrainian cities. Plus to that, the total neglect, not only for the life of their own soldiers. This is the military stupidity, try to storm the 5 million inhabited city just in the road columns by tanks together, but they are not thinking at all about the humans. That is why the only way is the military defeat of Russia. We, just 1 minute.
Yes.
It is difficult to expect that in weeks, in months, we will see the political defeat at the grounds of the international organization. That is why we have the choice. The proper armed army, motivated army, the regime will fail. Plus to that, sanctions comprehensive sanctions. And by doing this for Ukraine, we will also doing this for Syria.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a few words. And I call the floor the Syria ambassador, Mr. Bilal.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أنا راح أتكلم بالعربية
Will
طبعا.
speak in Arabic. From the outset, I would like to thank the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Work Studies to focus on what's been happening in Syria for the last 11 years or so, and what has been happening in the Ukraine in the last 3 months. The common thing about the two cases is the same perpetrator of these crimes and the lack of accountability. I thank both speakers, Mr. Fadel and Ms. Oleksandra. We can move a little bit beyond the academic direction, and like what our colleague Oleksandra said, these are not just numbers. These are martyrs. They are victims. Some lost their entire families, and there are some who lost all their children and they are left alone now. And there are those whose entire town or village was destroyed because of the indiscriminate, some say, but we say deliberate attack. I remember the same happening in Daraa in 2018 when this Assad regime invaded the city of Daraa. After 15 days, their army could not advance 1 centimeter. Then the Russian Air Force got involved very violently and using scorched earth policy, the same policy they used in Chechnya and elsewhere before, which resulted, of course, to the people who the young men who had to raise their arms to defend their town. They could not face such an onslaught by the Russian airplanes with only a Kalashnikov rifle. And in my personal experience, I was in Daraa in March 2011 when the peaceful demonstrations started. On the first day, the regime forces responded with live bullets. The aim was to break the will of people, the same people who suffered under a regime, a dictatorial regime for 50 years. If they go out to demonstrate against it, they wanted to break their will. The Syrian regime used chemical weapons. Everybody knows it kills everything. It kills trees, animals, human beings. These chemical weapons were used on more than one occasion, yet the international community and international organizations have not held anybody accountable. No mechanisms for that are available, despite the red lines, supposedly. In the Ghouta, more than 1,500 men, women, and children. There were families who went to bed and they never woke up. In Douma, in Khan Sheikhun, this is all documented, but until now there has been no move on behalf of the international community. In fact, it's very embarrassing, to say the least, when we say that the international community failed totally in holding the perpetrators accountable. And until today, the crimes are not just acts of murder. Now, the people in detention and those who hundreds of thousands of them, we don't know whether they're dead or alive. Recently, there was video images. Some were killed, murdered in 2013, but their families only found out now that they were actually killed. They were forcefully made to disappear, and nobody knew their fate. The other crime is forcefully expelling and turning people into internal refugees or displaced. This is another crime against humanity, the aim behind which was ethnic cleansing, and entire villages were forced to leave their locations. Finally, I want to say that the Syrian people died through different means, with chemical weapons, direct killing, aerial bombardment, slaughtered by knives, and videos can testify to that. They died through drowning when they were trying to flee across the sea, died because of severe winter conditions when they tried to escape through Lebanon, Turkey, and other countries. But we would like to remind everybody that the Syrian people still insist on their freedom, and they will never bulge, they will never go back, not even 1 inch. And with the help of God, we would continue our struggle to achieve our legal and legitimate rights fully and comprehensively. Thank you, Your Excellency. شكرا لك على هذه الإضافة، وأضفت إلى ما سمعناه من الشهادات والإحصائيات والمعلومات المعمقة.
Forced mass
وشكرا
displacement as one of the results of the indiscriminate and targeted killing of civilians. Now we can open the floor for questions. We can take the questions in Arabic and English. The answers would be English. Okay, who will open? Okay, ladies.
Hello, my name is Abida. I work at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. Thank you so much to the speakers for your really insightful remarks and for the ambassadors for their speeches. Someone earlier on the panel mentioned the use of sanctions as a way to hold Russia and its allies responsible. I wanted to ask on their insights on the effectiveness, the true effectiveness of sanctions, especially considering the fact that especially recently, we see a lot of news and reports about how sanctions actually disproportionately affect the civilians who aren't really, part of the ones who are, inflicting the harm and the crimes, and they don't end up affecting the elites and people connected to the governments more often. So I wanted to hear your insights on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abida. Next.
Thank you so much for the presentations. My question is about actually...
Can you please introduce yourself?
Sorry, my name is Mushfik. I'm from United Nations, International Organization for Migration. So my question, the wars that happened for last years and ongoing wars have showed that it's not only crisis in this region, but actually the world is going through the crisis. And the international organizations failed to prove themselves as well. So they are in crisis as well. So we saw that the United Nations is not in a position to make a decision. We saw the crisis in the European Union. Even we witnessed the crisis in NATO, and so forth and so on. My question to you, the representative of the civil societies, so how do you see your role in a world where the significance of international organizations are decreasing? And do you think that it is a beginning of the new order where the nation states are the primary and the only actor? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take another question. I think someone next to...
Right.
Okay, we'll take a third question. get some answers, and then we can come back for a second round.
Thank you, and I'm happy to host this event in the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies to highlight on the war crimes committed in both countries. And I have a question to the four speakers about, what similarity do they see with the case of the State of Israel, 75 years of war crimes committed against the Palestinian people, speaking about ethnic cleansing, displacement, continuous attack on civilians, non-stop war crimes, and why they are embezzled, or why they are disappointed with the response of the international community if they have seen what is going on in Palestine for the last, how many years now? 75 years.
At least.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan Kahlout, the director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. I think let's go to Kiev. And yes, Ms. Oleksandra, if you can respond to a few of the questions.
I will. First of all, thank you for your questions. They needed very detailed answers, but I will try to be brief. The first question about sanctions. We have to understand that sanctions is only one of instruments how to influence to the situation. And this is not a solution for everything. And in order to use this instrument effectively, we have to understand what the goal of the whole strategy and this component, like particular. For current moment, when we speak about Ukraine and our promoting sanctions against Russia, we ask for such level of sanctions which can stop the ability of Russian economy to feed this war. And that's why we constantly asking international allies to cut all Russian banks from SWIFT, not several, but all, to stop trading with Russia with energy supplies, because Russia had a profit from this war. The price for energy supplies increased in 3 times, and this provide new money for Putin's regime. So also we have to understand that sanctions is not substitute to justice. We can put people who severely violate human rights in Magnitsky Act and frozen their assets and stop their ability to travel to European countries and other countries of well-developed democracies. But we also have to find a way how to hold these people who committed severe human rights violation accountable on personal level, because criminal responsibility is individual. Second, question about international organizations. I will start with my personal story. Last year, I was nominated by Ukraine to be a member of UN Committee Against Torture. And it was a voting for more than 160, if I'm not mistaken, countries who have elected the members of the committee. From my region, Eurasia region, it was 2 candidates. I'm from Ukraine, and another expert from Russia. 1 week before this election, it was a huge scandal with torture in Russian Federation, where the cruel scene of rape were emerged in the internet, which show that torture is institutionalized practice in penitentiary system of Russia. But countries voted yes for expert from Russia and not for me as a human rights defender from Ukraine. So what I want to tell, when we speak with UN, with Council of Europe, with OSCE, what they can do in order to stop these atrocities, or to at least to make the frozen effect for their brutalities. And they answered, we can do nothing. Like, it's a guilt of Russia. I think it's not the right answer. I have no doubt about Putin's regime, but maybe something wrong with the world, and the international architecture of peace and security, where Putin can invade Ukraine and for months committed atrocities, and nobody can stop it. So maybe something wrong with this international architecture, which is laying now in ruin, like Ukrainian Mariupol. And I think that we have to be very honest, that we have to start the process of reforming international organizations. And third, when we speak about human rights violation, my answer is very simple. I am a human rights defender, and I'm not on the side of some concrete country or parties or allies. I'm on a side on people whose rights are violated, regardless who committed these violations.
Thank you, Oleksandra. Yes, Fadel.
Thank you very much, for questions and for comment. There are many. First of all, I wrote at the beginning of Russia invasion in February 2020 that Ukraine stood beside the Syrian people and voted for the Syrian sake in all of the UN security, in all of the UN Human Rights Council. So we need to stood beside Ukraine. That's just I forget to mention that. And I'm totally agree with the ambassador that, and that's written in my paper, but due to the pressure from the moderator, and I'm willing to share the paper with the center. They can share it with you as well. That yeah, indeed, those are deliberated and intentional attack. Why is that? We always, like, as a documenter is seeking for evidence. We recorded a repeated attack on vital centers like hospitals, civil defense centers, schools. Those repeated attack on those specific centers indicate that these unlawful attack were deliberated, and there is inevitability they will lead to other types of violations. So this destruction is actually an aim itself in order to generate other types of violation, like the shilling, the deliberated shilling or the indiscriminate shilling. For sure they will lead to destruction, killing, injured, loss of properties, forced displacement, and spread panic. And those also consequences are deliberated, both of them. So that we have 13 million Syrian displaced internally and refugees. The next point is that for sure Russia doesn't care at all in following any customary law, or and they are implementing only power and veto, and even they are using, and they are violating the UN Charter. They are using veto in, and I'm arguing that in the Russia in Syria and in Ukraine as well. Russia, and there is like a debate in law about that, because Russia is being a party in those both conflict, and at the same time they are using veto for their own sake. Regarding the sanction, and sanction is a huge topic, and I think it's worth to have a specific lecture and to talk about Caesar law and maybe dealing with sanction, not in general as a general topic, but in a specific case, a specific conflict. So in Syria, and I wrote an essay about sanction, but very briefly due to the time, what is the effectiveness of the sanction against the civilians in between other factors? Sanction actually became 6 or 7 on the list. What is the first or second? 13 million displaced out of Syria. That smashed the economy. then the looting from Assad regime, spending the expenditure for the military sake, and all of, so there is like many factors before effectiveness of the sanction. Sanction also, of course, will, so that I'm saying it should be not the only tools. We need to build on sanction, and we need to build on the civil society, and that leads me to the other question. We need to build on the civil society work and on the UN investigation on human rights to achieve the solveness of the conflict itself. So that I'm saying this need to pressurize the international community to end this conflict via a political process, and that will also via, of course, transitional period path. The next question talking about what is the rule. I think the only rule of the civil society and our partner like international and the UN as well. We are working with Commission of Inquiry since 11 years and other human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, is to keep documenting, to keep demanding, and to keep naming and shaming the perpetrator. And this is also part of accountability. Of course, we need always to seek for the highest level to prosecute the perpetrator, and also to seek for justice. That's always in our recommendation. But if there is a failure, and that lead me also to Dr. Ghassan question, and we are totally frustrated actually from the international community. But before that, otherwise actually no need to be here, no need to keep reporting. But I think that's the victim's right. If we didn't do that, the perpetrator will issue the report, will issue a news, and also faking the history. So they are not actually killing us and displaced us, but on contrary, they want to demolish the history for their own sake. Dr. Ghassan, you are of course, there is a similarity, especially for seizing properties and land, displaced the people, and all of those crimes, war crimes, and also crimes against humanity. It's a wide spread crimes targeting civilians. But yeah, I think that doesn't prevent us to feel frustrated from again and again, because there is a development in the law, establishment of the ICC convention against to prevent the use of chemical weapons, the only use after the convention, by the way, committed by the Syrian regime. So that doesn't prevent us to, first of all, holding them their responsibility. Geneva Convention, as you know, Doctor, the Article 1 is holding the state responsibility to fight war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is not only Syrian responsibility or Palestinian responsibility or Ukraine responsibility. All the states should come together, and that's they are ratifying. So we are holding them their responsibility. And when the Security Council failed, it should be movement out of the Security Council, because we are here facing between two contradictions: crimes against humanity being committed and then paralyzed from the UN Security Council, and that also other debate based on the law. And I don't want to keep talking. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Is there any more questions? We can take a few. Yes, sir.
Hello, hi. Just a quick question. When we, Mohammed, humanitarian and aid development worker. Speaking of the UN Security Council, United Nations Aicha used to do deconfliction for certain humanitarian let's say, hospitals or medical points. What I want to ask, in Syria, they were bombed by the Russians, although they were deconflicted. I want to ask if the same happened in Ukraine. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, do you want to take, is there any other? Yes, please.
Yeah, hi there. Daniel Fani, I'm here on a personal basis, not representing anybody. Just one question to the panelists. It has been put a lot of emphasis on accountability and responsibility, and probably looking back in history, the most striking example of accountability of something similar could have been the Nuremberg trial after World War II. And there has been also some other, if you want, smaller. It's not a nice adjective in these cases, but let's say there are smaller cases, let's say, worldwide. But my impression is that all these accountability, these trials, have always been done or been completed only after the people that has been put to trial were either defeated militarily or deposed politically. Is there any hope, and this is a question for the panelists, that accountability can be decoupled by defeat, politically or military?
Thank you, and I think we will stop here. Yes, can you take this question? One of these questions.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for highlighting the deconfliction mechanism and the failure of that in spite of like lots of hospitals and medical facilities being on this list, and in spite of that, it's been attacked by the Russian forces. About Ukraine, I'll leave the answer to my colleague. Regarding the accountability, and I'm agree with you. It's right that all the cases, like almost all the cases, been implemented after or after willing political will from maybe outside of the conflict parties. It's never been solved by the conflict. All the conflicts taught us that the solution coming from outside. Otherwise, the parties will never end it, because they plus and positive and negative, so 180 degrees. But to be honest and frank with you, and I don't think that it will be a solution also before defeat or without and interfere and put the both parties together and to impose a solution and pressure like this solution to be implemented. But if that happened, I think this is a movement from totalitarian, almost a dictatorship regime toward like a little bit maybe better stage. So this is a movement change, I think that the Syrian population is now became more engaged in a political life, and they are far much more aware about their rights. So they will fight for that in any future regime.
Thank you. So let's close the remarks with you, Oleksandra.
Thank you for your questions. First questions, regardless deliberate attack to international organization who provided assistance. I will start with a fact that international organization immediately after evacuation, after Russian invasion, evacuated their staff from the dangerous zone. And this is something which need to be rethinking in future, because they left us alone. And it was ordinary people, not international organizations, who rescued their life to provide humanitarian assistance to isolated cities, to help people who traveled in the rubbles of ruined residential buildings, and do a lot of other work. So is a question, why international organizations were not prepared to fulfill their duties. Why international organizations, when in March this year, we published an open appeal, which was signed by dozens of human rights organizations, and asked them to return and to be with us, to provide a field work, not from Geneva, Berlin, Vienna, or other safe places, but from the ground, to ensure international presence for current moment in occupied territories, don't respond. So it's a question to international organizations. And I must also try to emphasize to very interesting report. I have not opportunity to in details to go beyond the methodology. It's a report of humanitarian outcomes, and they show how much assistance to people during this war, I mean after February this year, was provided by Ukrainian civil society and volunteers initiative, and how much assistance were provided by international organizations. And I must admit that the difference is very huge, especially consider that fact that civil society and volunteers initiative, according to this report, have only 0.003% of all international assistance, which was supposed to be obtained by Ukrainian people. And second, I think that the question about accountability, not after when some countries who provide such crimes of aggression were defeated, it's a challenge. And this challenge has a historical character. And I think that we have at least a chance to stop this circle of impunity. And we have to use this chance, because this war have a very distinct value dimension. Putin tried to convince not only Ukrainian people, but to the whole world that the values of rule of law, of freedom, of democracy, of human rights, it's artificial values, that you couldn't rely upon on rule of law and justice when you are in war, that you can only rely upon on force. And if we will not be able to succeed in justice, it will encourage another authoritarian leaders to do the same.
Thank you so much for your additional remarks, and thank you for having joined us and contributing your time and experience on the ground to this topic. If I may add, just adding to what you said, sir, about the victor's justice, the whole international architecture in the aftermath of the Second World War was actually to go beyond the victor's justice, because that kind of justice was selective in its way, because it actually tried the defeated, but it did not try the allied crimes, which were numerous. So the international justice architecture that was built through the International Criminal Court, and before that, the International Court of Justice, the special tribunals, all this system was put there to go beyond the law of force and to give a chance to everyone, to the universal justice, which we have seen today on the topic of today. We heard that everyone is agreeing here that is not working. The international system is broken. And it's broken because the people or the leaders, those who are supposed to lead by example, they're leading by bad example. And let's not be afraid. Let's name them. Today we spoke about the crimes committed by Russia or in alliance with Russia. Russia is a member of the Security Council, and so is other members who are also taking advantage of the veto power. So the discussions we are having here, they've been reverberated everywhere. The main issue is accountability. And to go back to what you said, Mr. Kahlout, if you go back to the most recent reports of Mr. Michael Link, the UN Human Rights Council rapporteur on Palestine, he summed up the awful conclusion. He said clearly that the crimes committed by Israel, including by the Security Council, UN Security Council, which could not and was not willing and able to enforce its own resolutions, this lack of accountability, 74 years of lack of accountability, have led actually to a regime of apartheid. This is, it sums up the whole issue. So let's hope that this time around, with the case of Ukraine, and with the willingness of the Syrian people, and all of those who are supporting them around the world, let's hope that we will be able to push for justice for all. Thank you so much for your presence, for your contribution, and all the best. Thank you.